What if one day the house you built, the walls you painted, and the memories you carried were suddenly claimed by someone else? Imagine standing in your own living room only to be told you don't belong there. This is not just about bricks and wood. It's about dignity, about memory, and about the moment a quiet voice decides it will no longer be ignored. Because sometimes the most powerful battles are not fought with shouting, but with silence that finally refuses to bend. I was standing in the doorway of the living room, my hand resting on the frame as if the wood could steady me. The evening light stretched across the carpet I had chosen decades ago, yet suddenly it felt like I was trespassing in a place I had built with my own hands. My son's voice carried no anger, no rise in tone, only the flat certainty of someone explaining a fact. "You don't pay rent. You don't live here." He didn't look at me when he said it. His thumb tapped across his phone screen, irritated, distracted. His wife sat at the counter, stirring her tea with that faint smile that said, "Finally." That smile made me straighten my back even at 74. I repeated his words quietly, tasting them like something sour. "I don't pay rent?" Then I reminded him, "Matthew, this is my home." He sighed, impatient, as though I were the one making life difficult. He listed groceries, bills, school expenses, everything they covered. And me? I just lived here. Breathing in my own house now required their permission. My fingers trembled, but I folded them together, hiding it. Calm had always been my strength. 40 years of nursing had taught me how to keep my voice steady while the world collapsed around me. Tonight was no different. I said only 2 words, "I see." His wife glanced at him, then at me, checking if I understood my new role, the guest, the burden, the old woman who should be grateful for whatever corner of her own home they allowed her to occupy. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I turned away, walking past the family photos I had dusted that morning. His kindergarten smile, his gap-toothed grin, his teenage hug after a lost soccer match, all blurred now, not from age, but from something bitter. In my room, I closed the door gently, not because I feared disturbing them, but because I needed silence. My knees ached as I sat on the bed, smoothing the quilt I had sewn when my hands were steadier. What surprised me most was not the insult, but the clarity. He thought this house was his. He thought I was here by their grace. And sitting there in the dim light, I understood with a quiet certainty something had shifted. This was not their home. It had never been their home, and I was done being invisible in it. That night I didn't sleep. I lay listening to the refrigerator hum, the pipes settle, the oak tree brush against the siding. Familiar sounds, yet they felt different now, as if they belonged to a place that no longer recognized me. Strange how quickly a home can turn into just walls. 6 years earlier, Matthew and Claire had moved in for a few months. He had lost his job, the children were small, and they were struggling. I remember him standing on the porch, shoulders slumped, embarrassed. I opened my arms and my door without hesitation. "Stay as long as you need," I told him. That's what mothers say. That's what I believed. At first, they were grateful. Claire brought flowers, Matthew fixed the railing, the children hugged me every morning. For a while, it felt healing to have family bustling through the rooms George and I had built together. But gratitude has an expiration date. By the end of the first year, they no longer asked if they could use my living room. They simply used it. My kitchen became theirs. My quiet evenings became theirs to interrupt. My bedroom door became something they knocked on only when they needed something. "Mom, could you watch the kids? Mom, do you have $20? Always Mom, never thank you. And somewhere in there, the language shifted. They stopped saying, "We're staying with you." They started saying, "Our house." That was the erosion. Not earthquakes, but the slow crumbling of pieces you barely notice losing. But erosion only goes unnoticed until the ground finally gives way. What happens when the quiet mother decides the ground will no longer crumble beneath her feet? When Matthew and Claire first arrived, they promised it would be temporary. He had lost his job, the children were small, and they were struggling. I remember his voice trembling on the porch as he admitted he didn't know what to do. I opened the door without hesitation. "Stay as long as you need," I told him. "That's what mothers say." That's what I believed. At first, gratitude filled the house. Claire brought supermarket flowers. Matthew repaired the railing. The children hugged me each morning. For a while, it felt almost healing to have family bustling through the rooms George and I had built. But gratitude fades. It has an expiration date. By the end of the first year, they no longer asked if they could use my living room. They simply used it. My kitchen became theirs. My quiet evenings were interrupted without apology. My bedroom door became something they knocked on only when they needed something. "Mom, could you watch the kids?" "Mom, do you have $20? Always Mom. Never thank you. And somewhere in there, the language shifted. They stopped saying, "We're staying with you." They started saying, "Our house." That was how erosion worked. Not in sudden earthquakes, but in the slow crumbling of pieces you barely notice losing. The pantry was rearranged because Claire thought it made more sense. My sewing machine was carried into the garage because it took up too much space. He promised to bring it back. He never did. I let it pass, one concession at a time. By the third year, they were hosting barbecues in the backyard without asking. Neighbors waved at them, not me. Children I didn't know ran across the lawn George had planted by hand. Twice the roses were ruined. Claire shrugged. "They're just plants." But they weren't just plants. They were pieces of memory. Still, I swallowed the words. I kept telling myself Matthew was still the boy who cried when he broke his father's fishing rod, the boy who called me from college after failing his first exam. I told myself to be patient, to be understanding, to not push him away. But patience has a cost, and understanding becomes something else, something uglier, when it is given to people who no longer see your value. The erosion continued. My sewing room became the next target. Claire suggested it could be better used for storage. Matthew said families outgrow spaces quickly. I laughed quietly. This was a 4-bedroom house. But they didn't see rooms as mine. They saw them as theirs to claim. I refused for the first time. "No," I said. That word felt solid, heavier than I expected. Claire blinked, surprised. Matthew bristled, irritated. But I walked away, leaving their frustration behind me. In the sewing room, I closed the door and let the quiet wash over me. Sunlight fell across the wooden floor, catching loose buttons and thread. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with clarity. They didn't see this room as sacred. They didn't see the house as mine. They didn't see me at all. And for the first time, the thought that had flickered began to burn steadily. If they couldn't recognize the boundaries of my home, then I would draw boundaries they could not ignore. But once a boundary rises, it changes everything. What happens when the quiet mother decides the erosion has gone far enough? The erosion did not stop with the pantry or the sewing machine. It grew bolder, heavier, until one day they claimed the master bedroom. Not asked, not discussed, taken. They explained it would be better for the children to be closer to their bathroom. I was moved to the smaller room at the end of the hall. I told myself it was fine, that Matthew was stressed, Claire was overwhelmed, and the children needed stability. But deep inside, I wondered, when did I stop being someone they worried about? Nights became longer. I lay awake hearing them whisper about finances, jobs, vacations they wanted to take, vacations I knew I would never be invited to join. Each time I reminded myself, this is temporary. Once they got back on their feet, things would return to normal. But temporary is a sly word. It gives people time to settle into entitlement. By then, the house no longer felt like mine. Neighbors waved at them, not me. Children I didn't know ran across the lawn George had planted by hand. My roses were ruined twice. Claire shrugged. They're just plants. But they weren't just plants. They were pieces of memory. I swallowed it all because I remembered Matthew as a boy, soft-hearted, always trying to impress his father. I remembered the terrified teenager who called me from college after failing his first exam, and in every argument, every slight, every moment of disrespect, I kept telling myself, he's still that boy somewhere. Be patient, be understanding, don't push him away. But patience has a cost. Understanding becomes something else when it is given to people who no longer see your value. The master bedroom was not just a room. It was the space George and I had built together, painted together, lived in together. It was the heart of the house, and now it was gone. I moved into the smaller room quietly, folding my quilt across the bed, smoothing the corners as if that would make it feel like home. But it didn't. It felt like a corner, a place to be tucked away. And yet, even in that corner, something stirred. A quiet spark, faint but steady, because every concession, every silence, every swallowed word was building toward something. What happens when the spark inside a cornered woman grows into a flame that refuses to be hidden? The erosion had taken the master bedroom, but the next attempt cut deeper. Claire and Matthew began eyeing the sewing room, the one space I had managed to keep untouched. It was more than a room. It was a sanctuary. George's old workbench still stood there, his flannel shirt still hung on the back of a chair, and the faint smell of cedar lingered in the air. It was the last corner of the house that felt like mine. Claire approached carefully, her tone rehearsed. "We were thinking," she said, "that maybe it's time we did something about the guest room." She meant my sewing room. Matthew added, "It doesn't make sense for you to have 2 rooms when we're tight on space." I laughed softly, not out of humor, but disbelief. Tight on space? This is a 4-bedroom house. Claire smiled politely, patient in a way that grated. Families outgrow places quickly. You know how it is. I knew exactly how it was. They wanted my sanctuary, the room where memories lived, the room they had never dared to reorganize. For the first time, I said, no. Claire blinked, surprised. Matthew bristled, irritated. He stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Mom, don't make this difficult." But I wasn't making anything difficult. I was simply no longer making it easy. I walked away, leaving their irritation hanging in the air like smoke. In the sewing room, I shut the door behind me and let the quiet settle. Sunlight fell across the wooden floor, catching loose buttons and thread. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with clarity. They didn't see this room as sacred. They didn't see the house as mine. They didn't see me at all. And for the first time, the thought that had flickered inside me began to burn steadily. If they couldn't recognize the boundaries of my home, then I would draw boundaries they could not ignore. The silence in the house grew heavier after that. Matthew avoided me. Claire's politeness sharpened. Even the children moved around me carefully, sensing something had shifted. Perhaps they felt the boundary too. I made my tea the same way I had for 50 years, but it tasted different now, bitter, like something burned. It wasn't always like this. Memory has its own gravity, pulling me back to times when Matthew wasn't ashamed of me, when he was proud. But those days felt far away now. The sewing room became more than a space. It became a symbol, a line drawn, a reminder that I was not invisible. But once a line is drawn, it cannot be erased. What happens when the quiet mother decides the next boundary will be stronger than the last? The erosion of space was painful, but the erosion of identity cut deeper. I began to notice how Matthew spoke about me outside the house. It started years ago when he came home from college for Thanksgiving. He brought a girl with him, polished and confident. At dinner, she asked what I did for work. "I'm a nurse," I told her. Matthew quickly corrected, "She used to be. She's semi-retired now." I was still working full-time then. His words changed the truth, reshaped me into something smaller. The girl nodded, conversation moved on, and Matthew didn't meet my eyes. That was the first stone laid in the distance between us. Then came Claire, beautiful, composed, always dressed as if she were attending a fundraiser. She never said anything cruel outright, but her politeness carried sharp edges. She looked at my oak dining table and said, "Vintage is so charming." She admired my curtains with, "They feel nostalgic." Nostalgic in her mouth meant outdated. Slowly, Matthew stopped inviting me to office parties. He stopped introducing me to his friends. When asked where he grew up, he added quickly, "It's a small old neighborhood. Mom kept everything very traditional." Traditional, another word with teeth. When George died, they were attentive for a while, but grief fades for everyone except the one who carries it. For me, it grew heavier. For them, life moved on. I hoped things would change when they had children. I dreamed of laughter in the yard, holidays filled with warmth again. But Claire set the tone early. "We don't want them picking up outdated habits," she said, when I tried teaching my granddaughter how to knead dough. Outdated habits, as if I were passing on a disease. Matthew nodded. Every nod widened the gap. The moment that carved itself into my memory came 3 years ago at a restaurant Claire loved. It was her birthday. I wore my mother's pearls, a navy skirt, a soft blouse. I felt almost pretty. Someone asked Matthew what his parents did. He spoke proudly of his father's construction work. Then came the question about me. He hesitated, cleared his throat, and said, "She stayed home mostly." I nearly dropped my fork. 39 years in a hospital, holding dying hands, delivering babies, saving lives, paying bills, raising a child alone, and my son dismissed it all with 4 words. Stayed home mostly. I didn't confront him. I didn't make a scene. I swallowed the hurt quietly, the way women of my generation often do. But it lodged deep, a splinter waiting for the right moment to push back to the surface. Now, standing in the present, watching Matthew and Claire move through my home as if it were built for them, that splinter throbbed. They weren't just disrespectful, they weren't just entitled, they were rewriting history, his and mine. And last night's words had finally woken something that had lain dormant too long. You don't pay rent, you don't live here. He had no idea what those words had unlocked in me. He had no idea the ground beneath his feet had already begun to shift. But when history is rewritten, the truth does not disappear. What happens when the quiet mother decides to write her own chapter, one they cannot erase? The erosion of space and identity had already taken its toll, but the next step was sharper. Claire and Matthew began to speak of money. They stood in the kitchen, voices steady, faces firm. Claire said, "It would make things easier if you paid rent, just a symbolic amount to show appreciation." I listened quietly. Appreciation for what? I asked. For being allowed to live in the home I own? Matthew rubbed his temples, uneasy. Claire crossed her arms, her tone sharper now. Maybe 1,200 per month. I repeated the number softly. 1,200. The silence stretched between us, heavy. Claire looked triumphant. Matthew looked guilty, but not enough to stop him. I thought of George, of the years we spent paying off the mortgage, of the bills I had handled alone after his death. 30 years of responsibility, every repair, every tax, every insurance payment, and now, in the house that bore my name on every document, they wanted rent. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply said, "I see." Those 2 words carried more weight than they realized, because in that moment I understood. This wasn't care. This wasn't family. This was a transaction they had rewritten in their minds. And if they wanted to talk money, then money and documents were exactly where I would go next. The tension in the house thickened after that. Claire moved with clipped footsteps. Matthew avoided my eyes. The children tiptoed around me. But I had already named the truth, and once a truth has a name, it cannot be buried. I overheard them again, voices carrying through the walls. Claire said, "The house is wasted on her." Matthew sighed. "She's not going to just agree to move out." Claire insisted, "She will. She's old. People her age don't fight these things." They thought I wouldn't fight. They thought I would bend, but they had no idea what those words had unlocked in me. If they want to turn family into a transaction, what happens when the quiet mother brings forward the documents that prove the truth? The tension in the house had become almost physical, clinging to the walls like humidity. Claire moved with clipped footsteps, Matthew avoided my eyes, and the children tiptoed around me. But I had already named the truth, and once a truth has a name, it cannot be buried. One evening, I noticed a stack of papers left on the kitchen counter, insurance forms, school documents, and a folder labeled Future Home Plans. Curiosity didn't drive me. Instinct did. I opened it. Inside were printed floor plans of my house, rearranged and remodeled. Walls removed, bedrooms converted, closets reassigned. Notes scribbled in Claire's handwriting. Knock down this wall for open layout. Turn sewing room into nursery. Use Evelyn's bedroom for office storage. Her words cut deeper than any argument. Her bedroom, her closets, my spaces claimed as theirs. At the bottom of the stack lay the real blow, an article titled "How to Talk to Aging Parents About Assisted Living," highlighted, annotated, prepared. Their plan was not just to push me aside, but to push me out entirely. I closed the folder carefully, set it back exactly as I had found it, and walked to the window. Outside, dusk settled over the yard. George's oak tree stood tall, planted the year Matthew was born. Each ring inside its trunk held a piece of our life together. I placed my hand on the windowsill, the old wood smooth beneath my palm. I whispered softly, not out of weakness, but because truth sounds stronger when spoken quietly. "They think this house is theirs." Then after a breath, "They have no idea." Because in that moment, something clicked into place with the finality of a locked door. This wasn't about bedrooms or bills. It wasn't even about respect anymore. This was about ownership of my home, my history, my remaining years. They had redrawn their version of the story. Now it was my turn to draw lines they could not cross. I walked back to the sewing room, closed the door behind me, and sat at George's old workbench. My knees ached, my fingers weren't as nimble as they once were, but my mind was steady. The storm had been gathering for years. Now it was ready to break. What happens when the quiet mother, dismissed and underestimated, finally decides to fight for her home with the certainty of a locked door? The folder of plans had revealed everything. They weren't just rearranging rooms, they were preparing to erase me from the house entirely. Assisted living, storage conversions, nursery expansions, all written as if my presence were temporary, as if my life could be boxed away like old furniture. I sat at George's workbench in the sewing room, the one place they hadn't yet claimed. My knees ached, my fingers weren't as nimble as they once were, but my mind was steady. The storm had been gathering for years, and now it was ready to break. This was no longer about bedrooms or bills. It wasn't even about respect. It was about ownership of my home, my history, and my remaining years. They thought I would bend. They thought I would fade quietly. But they had underestimated me. I remembered the years of double shifts at the hospital, the mortgage payments made one by one, the nights raising Matthew alone after George passed. Every sacrifice had built this house, brick by brick, memory by memory. And now those sacrifices stood as proof that this was mine. The silence in the house grew heavier each day. Claire moved with sharp steps, Matthew avoided my eyes, and the children sensed the shift. They tiptoed around me, careful, uncertain. Perhaps they felt the boundary too. I folded my hands in my lap, exhaled slowly, and understood with clarity. They had redrawn their version of the story. Now it was my turn to draw lines they could not cross. The storm was no longer waiting. It was here. They thought she would bend. They thought she would fade. But what happens when the quiet mother finally decides to fight for her home with the certainty of a locked door? The folder of plans had shown me everything: remodeling notes, nursery expansions, even articles about assisted living. They weren't just rearranging rooms, they were preparing to erase me. But what they didn't realize was that their plans had already set mine in motion. I began moving through the house differently. Each step carried a new certainty. I no longer felt like a guest walking carefully through someone else's space. I was the owner, reclaiming what had always been mine. I thought of George, of the years we spent building this home piece by piece. I thought of the nights I worked double shifts, the mornings I paid bills, the afternoons I raised Matthew alone. Every sacrifice had built this place, and now those sacrifices stood as proof. The silence in the house grew heavier. Claire's footsteps were sharp, Matthew's eyes avoided mine, and the children sensed the shift. They tiptoed around me, careful, uncertain. Perhaps they felt the boundary too. I folded my hands, exhaled slowly, and understood. They had redrawn their version of the story. Now it was my turn to draw lines they could not cross. The storm was no longer waiting. It was here, and this time it would not pass quietly. They thought she would fade into silence, but what happens when the quiet mother finally decides to speak with the strength of ownership? The storm had gathered long enough. It was no longer whispers in hallways or quiet sighs over tea. It was a truth that demanded action. They thought I would bend. They thought I would fade, but they had underestimated me. I sat at George's workbench, the old cedar scent still lingering, and began to plan. This was not about arguments or raised voices. It was about clarity. Ownership was not a matter of opinion. It was written in documents, signed in ink, paid for with decades of sacrifice. The next morning, I moved through the house with a new certainty. Each step carried weight. I was no longer the guest they imagined. I was the owner reclaiming her ground. Matthew avoided my eyes. Claire's footsteps grew sharper, and the children sensed the shift. They tiptoed around me, careful, uncertain. Perhaps they felt the boundary, too. I gathered the papers that proved the truth: deeds, tax receipts, insurance records. Every line spoke louder than their demands. This was not their house. It had never been their house. When the moment came, I spoke calmly, the way I had spoken to patients in difficult times. This home was built by George and me, room by room, paycheck by paycheck. It is mine, and I will not be moved. Silence followed, not the resentful silence of earlier weeks, but a heavier one, a silence shaped by boundaries that could no longer be ignored. They had tried to erase me. They had tried to rewrite history, but history was not theirs to claim. It was mine, and now the lines were drawn. The storm had broken, and in its wake, dignity stood tall. They thought she would fade into silence, but what happens when the quiet mother, underestimated for too long, finally claims her home with the strength of truth?